Welcome to the State of the Nation. I'm your host, Mike Sham. And as you know, we have been following politics very closely, as we do on this channel. And one of the things that has been the story over the last couple of months post the election has been the government of national unity. And a lot has been said about the fact that the government of national unity recently turned 100 days of the government of national unity. And there's been a lot of analysis about whether it's been good, bad, or ugly. And I think sometimes it depends, certainly from a political side. Those that are outside the GNU think it's the worst thing ever. Those inside the GNU seem to be liking it, and Panyaza Lesufi seems to hate it. But if there's one person that analyzes the GNU and politics very closely and backs it up with data, is our guest, and one of the most popular guests we have on the show, and that is Dr. Frans Cronje. Frans, welcome to the State of the Nation.
Mike, hi. Good to be here.
So 100 days the GNU turned. Apparently that's meant to be something. It's fairly, just for background to anybody that wants to know why everybody keeps talking about 100 days. This was started by Franklin Roosevelt, right?
Yeah.
When he got voted, and America was in the midst of the Depression, and he said, give me 100 days before you assess what I did. And that just sort of stuck. And our politics, good and bad, big countries and not big countries, seem to do a test at 100 days as if it's just a nice round figure. What do you make of the first 100 days of the government of national unity?
Well, let's do the test.
Okay.
First thing we saw is yields on South African bonds came off pretty strongly. Now, bond yields fall as prices rise, and prices rise because of demand. And this is actually a very good historical South African indicator, because from around 98, in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis, into around 2008, South African yields came off sustainably, and I mean on a long-term slide. There's a huge statement of confidence in the country. And subsequent to that, after the global financial crisis, we saw yields edging their way up and up and up and up, and it's a statement of the opposite of confidence. So yields came off very quickly. That's the rest of the world looking at us and saying, this is a positive interpretation of what you guys have done. We've seen consumer confidence tick up slightly from a decade of losing ground. We've seen business confidence tick up slightly after a decade of losing ground. But both of those, consumer and business confidence, are still way off the highs that those indicators reached, again, in the aftermath of the Asian crisis in 98, and between that and the departure of Mbeki in around 2008. We've seen the currency come back pretty strongly, and there's a lot of domestic writing on that and the statement of confidence. It's partly that, but also if you read the dollar index, you've seen that the dollar's come off. Dollar's weakened by essentially the extent that the rand has strengthened since the GNU. So the hard sort of financial confidence investment indicators are positive. This is a good start. At 100 days or just ahead of that, we tested national opinion. Really interesting. Start with the politics. Support for the ANC is up by about 5-6 percentage points. So they got, in the election in May, the ANC got 40%. If there was an election a week ago, the ANC would have got 45 or 46. Now, the margin of error on that survey, that's the extent by which we estimate we could be out, is 3 percentage points. So the ANC's gain is double the margin of error, which means that it's very, very strong and very, very real. The DA is up from, it got, what did it get, 22, shy of 22. It's up to about 24. So that's also it's strongly up. But it's 66% of the margin of error that it's up as well. So those parties are up. Parties outside of the GNU, in the main, are way down. EFF, 9% down to 6%. That's hugely down. MK, 14 down to 12. Interesting is that the gain in the ANC, the quantum of the gain, is accounted for exactly by what has walked out of the EFF and out of MK. And the gain in the DA is almost, in the quantum of it wouldn't be exactly the same people, is that the Freedom Front, which admittedly is in the GNU, is also off. So your first read on that would be that, yeah, the parties inside the GNU, they're doing great. And if you go a step further and you test public sentiment towards the GNU, so questions such as, is it working well? What do you think of the DA's performance in the GNU? What do you think of the ANC's performance? Was it the right thing for the DA to go in? Was it the right thing for the ANC to kick out MK and the EFF and go with the DA instead? On all of those questions, strong majorities of South Africans are very keen on the GNU. So the hard, measurable, your question, how's it 100 days in? The investment indicators, the confidence indicators, the political indicators, and the domestic opinion indicators all point in the same direction, that through the first 100 days, this deal was very well received.
So, all good news and going along, but it's not without its problems.
Yeah. Oh, well, this is 100 days.
It's 100 days.
Now, Roosevelt's 100 days has its limitations.
Yeah. And right. It ain't 1932 anymore.
Yeah. Well, let's. What's it going to be like at 300 days?
Yeah.
One way to start to understand how it might be is to go back and look at our own history. And after the ANC came to power in 94, contrary to what's written about it in the mainstream press, that party in power did pretty well. In its first decade, it doubled the number of people in employment. It recorded a budget surplus, the first sustained surpluses since the formation of the Union. It cut government debt to GDP in half. It rolled out a social grants program that went from 3 million to 12 million beneficiaries in a decade. It built far more houses by a factor of 10 to 1 than shacks were going up, and it did really well. And as a consequence, its support rose. And in 2004, after a decade of really good service delivery and real job growth, not jobless growth, which is what the press continues to report, ANC support was up 6 percentage points. The levels of violent protest in the country, which you can measure by what share of all protest actions are violent, had come off by 50%. And the murder rate, which is just a good kind of measure of the craziness of society, in 94, that was 60 per 100,000. So that means 60 in every 100,000 people in the country were murdered in a given year. That had come off to just above 30. So we'd become a lot safer. All of that was informed by the fact that life in South Africa was improving at regular intervals and on a steady upward drift for the great majority of its people. When that changed, which was concurrent with 2008, the departure of Mbeki and the global financial crisis and the craziness of the state capture era and all of that, and we saw the confidence indicators that I mentioned to you earlier collapse, and we saw yields, the South African 10-year yield begin to lift as bond prices fell, which is a diminishing demand, and demand's diminishing because there's no confidence in the future of the country. ANC support collapsed with it. And so the very simple lesson for all of this is that South Africa's political system over the last 30 years has worked pretty well. When the government of the day has governed well, people have rewarded it with increasing support. And when it's governed badly, the last decade saw virtually zero net new job creation. Someone might say, well, it created 2 million jobs. First decade after 94, we doubled the number of people in employment. If let's call it this, it's the political system here has a natural inbuilt immune response to bad government. If you do not improve the basic living standards of people, support for you will be hammered into the longer term. And I'm fairly certain the same rule is going to apply to the GNU. So it's 100 days honeymoon period relative to what might have been absolute catastrophe. Of course, there's relief. If this new administration cannot, into 300 days and 600 days and 900 days, put the country back on the confidence and then fixed investment curve, which informs the growth curve, which informs the upwards jobs curve, expect that people will grow frustrated with the GNU. And then they will develop contempt for the GNU. And then then they'll start to look at alternatives. And one of those alternatives in the long, I'm not saying this will happen, but is the long delayed era of radical populism, So I'm not sure that without very much higher levels of confidence and therefore fixed investment and therefore growth, that we're going to see this level of confidence hold in the GNU, whether you measure that in the bond market, or whether you measure that in the currency, or whether you measure that in the opinions of South African voters.
So it's at the edge, the GNU. It's kind of working now. At the start has been good. Thereafter, the jury's out.
It's a very great thing, the GNU.
Yes.
It was a phenomenal achievement for all the people involved, and during the negotiation period too. It really was very, very good. And so that in a relative sense, given what might have been, we, or people who live in the country, as I do, as you do, I think are very fortunate that we didn't test the alternative. However, I'm unconvinced that the senior political leadership of the top end of the GNU is urgent enough in its pursuit of confidence. Look, the way these things go, number one is confidence. You're confident in the environment. It's the cheapest form of stimulus. If confidence lifts, what happens is fixed investment levels lift. You measure these things as a share of GDP. And South Africa's fixed investment levels are far off where they should be for the kind of emerging market that the country is. When fixed investment lifts, it means your capital committed to the country is lifting, then economic growth lifts. And when economic growth lifts, then job creation lifts. And it's complete nonsense that this relationship doesn't apply. You get these silly economists at sort of universities who say trickle-down economics, it doesn't work. Crap. It works brilliantly, and it's done so over the last 15 years here. You can, the tie between the one confidence and the investment and the growth and the jobs and the confidence and the diminishing violence is almost perfect. I think there's a great country risk that the creation of the GNU itself and evading the catastrophe that the alternative would have brought about is being seen as the success and the result. It is a success, but you need to build on that to take. You need to nearly double fixed investment to GDP levels and get growth up to approaching sustainably 4 or 5% of GDP to develop any real certainty that South Africa is now on a track to become a stable and prosperous emerging market.
Because one of the things that one can say about the GNU and South Africa as it's governed now is that perhaps people in certain portfolios are trying a little bit harder, but we still have the same bad policies as what we had before.
Yeah,
There's absolutely no economic plan, right? It's just let's do the same thing, but do it to perhaps a little bit better and cut the corruption down to, let's lop a zero off the sort of corruption number.
Yeah, a bit more efficiency is useful.
Yeah,
doing things but better and cutting out some of the corruption. That's all great, but these are not the substantive reasons why South Africa's economy has underperformed its emerging market peers by such an extraordinary extent over the past 15 years. The trouble essentially is that it's a hostile environment for the commitment of capital. Capital gets taxed on the way in, and there's enormous uncertainty. Things like national health insurance and so on contribute to that to a far greater extent than I think is properly understood. And it's so you're taxing capital coming into the country through BE policy and the like, which is fine. You can do that if you're a sovereign state. You can do whatever you want to do, but it does mean that you're relatively less competitive than your emerging market peers. On top of that, you add an existential threat such as national health insurance, and it's an existential threat because without world-class private health insurance, South Africa is not going to retain its middle class. Without retaining the middle class, you don't retain the entrepreneurial engine of the economy that's necessary to draw and turn that capital commitment into much higher levels of growth. So that exists. Then you get to external questions such as the skills base. There's a chart I produce that I sometimes show to people that tracks children through their school career. So if you imagine that in grade one every year the class is just more than 1 million kids, and that's 100%. And if you track them through their careers, when you get to grade 10, 90% of the kids are still in school, so we've done pretty well. But if you go from grade 10 to grade 12, you get a massive dropout of kids leaving the system. Looking for real quality in the education system, we measure the number of kids that pass maths in high school with a grade of 50% or higher. It's 6 kids of the 100 that sat in the grade 1 class 12 years ago. And the trouble with that, if you were a 1950s kind of, or even a Victorian sort of workhouse economy, you might absorb some of those people into employment. But the structure of South African GDP, that measures where's value in the economy created. Is it in the primary sectors, stuff we dig out of the ground, mining and farming, or the secondary sectors, the things we make, or the tertiary sector, which is a high-tech, high-skilled world? South Africa's economy is absolutely dominated by high-tech, high-skilled services type industries. But the skills base is a sort of 1950s pre-industrializing emerging market skills base. Jump beyond the skills base to something like energy. The Eskom chairman and his team have done so very well to get the lights on again. Something we did predict on the show would happen, because we knew we knew how policy would shift in the aftermath of Andre de Ruyter. They've been very successful. And if the energy minister is given his head to continue doing, which is really support for and later refurbishment of the defunct coal fleet, South Africa, from an energy perspective, will generate enough power to take an energy-imposed ceiling, which currently exists, off any long-term growth forecast for the country. So just by refurbishing coal, we can get that right. We don't need to build much new grid. We don't need to build new power plants. We need to refurbish the existing ones. And for 20, and with some private solar and the like, the South African economy will be all right. But our European and American trade partners wish for us not to do this. And almost the centerpiece of both European and American doctrine towards Southern Africa is decarbonization. Get them to turn off the carbon. If this GNU succumbs to that kind of pressure, it will not be a success. It will fail. The green certainly has its place, and in the fullness of time, nuclear for sure. But if you do serious estimates of the quantum of electricity South Africa will need to draw the industrial growth necessary to mop up the enormous unemployment figure, particularly read against what I've told you about the maths passes in matric, it's an absurdity, the numbers, to think that you can do that with solar or wind power and the grid bill to carry that solar or wind power from, in solar's case, the west of the country, into the central and eastern regions and southern regions where economic activity is most intense. So the GNU, great thing, fantastic result, well done. And however, no major policy reforms are now on the agenda to improve the competitiveness. And in fact, there are major policy headwinds. And many of those headwinds are being forced upon us by some of our most important trade partners.
Well, the one area where there's lots of competition and great efficiency is in car rental. So support Pace Car Rental, who sponsor our show. Let's keep them on the road, because now we're going to get into the bumpy bits about the part that actually threatens the government of national unity. And one of those things is infrastructure, potholes. That's why you've got to go rent a car to negotiate the potholes. But let's talk about those threats facing the GNU, because as you said, obviously the biggest threat is stop going forward, and the GNU is automatically in trouble.
Yeah.
Right. And, right now we benefiting off the lift in confidence, the easy stuff, bond yields going down. By the way, the bond yields, if anybody's confusing, is the price that we have to pay to get people to lend us money. That's what all your interest rate is the price that we are charging people to give us money, because we can't generate our own money. And South Africa runs quite significant deficits. We've discussed that before. But there's the political angle to trying to undermine the GNU, and we are seeing that in full force at the moment. It's certainly, the game has started. And that is people, in some cases, inside the GNU, and in some cases outside of the GNU, that would like to bring the whole show down, right? And probably the most pressing threat is within the ANC itself, where despite what polling says that people are enjoying this, that it is doing some recovery work to the ANC's vote, its alliance partner in the Communist Party wants to bring the GNU down. Just to show that, the thing with communists generally is that they want things not to work, not to work, right? That's the difference. We see it in Cuba, where they've had complete blackout of the entire country. Communists love the country not to work that way. You're more reliant on the state, and that's really their ultimate aim. But that's possibly the biggest threat within the GNU, as I see it at the moment, from a political point of view. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. It's the most amazing thing, to what you speak of here. Especially if you've watched the ANC for 20 years, 30 years. The ANC politically gets stronger and stronger the more it moderates and the more pragmatic it becomes. The strongest it was ever at politically was when it was running budget surpluses. And its ideological sort of left-wing partners at the time were extremely angry that it would do such a thing, and that it should rather blow out the deficit and borrow heavily to increase social protection. It was mad, because the ANC social welfare gains in the first decade, 3 million welfare recipients becomes 12 million, were financed by cutting government debt levels, which means you cut the interest that the interest bill of the state. You redirect the interest bill towards social welfare. In its conservative, call it that, pragmatic, staid, moderate eras, ANC political power rises. Where it allows its left-wing ideological critics to take the steering wheel, it just absolutely crashes. The share of protest actions in the country that are violent increased from 7 or 8% in 2008 to 30% through that sort of populist era in between 2008 and let's say 10 years, 2017, 2018. We've just said, and we just on this show, we've just said the ANC in 3 months is up 5 or 6 percentage points after doing the deal with the DA. A deal, by the way, that was immensely popular amongst ANC supporters even before it was done. If I said to the ANC when we got these numbers back, if you just hold the line on what you were doing on the GNU, you will be at 50% plus by Christmas of 2025. It's easy. And then you get this amazing effort from the sort of more popular side of the ANC to sabotage it all. Strike the deal. The EFF is collapsing support. But there seem to be people, particularly in Gauteng, who wish to save the EFF from collapse. The EFF is the ANC's rival. We've just shown, I mean, I'm obviously we say this when we're not on the shows as well, but to people, the DA is not an ANC political rival. DA is a multi-generational middle-class party. That's where it gets its votes from. The ANC can't compete there anymore because those people are too scared of state capture and potholes and load shedding ever to go back to the ANC, or not in any foreseeable future. The DA cannot fish in key ANC markets like the urban periphery of the aspirant middle class because the DA is too stigmatized as some sort of right-wing dinosaur party. So it's the perfect marriage for the ANC. And it's a popular marriage, and the EFF's busy collapsing, and then you have ANC strategists who say, no, we want to reverse this. We want to kick the DA out, put the EFF back in, crash the confidence, which will crash the fixed investment. We'll put upward pressure on debt and the deficit again. Job growth goes back to zero, and that the ANC will just be annihilated if we remain a free society. So it's an extraordinary. I don't know what to make of it, really. As you can see, it's just been an extraordinary thing to observe. Time and again in the ANC, it allows a radical populist influence to totally undermine the otherwise significant successes that it's recorded in the aftermath of '94, and if it does so again, it really will be the most extraordinary thing to observe.
Yeah, because I suppose what we will see is that it may not survive as the ANC. The block of voters will follow the next thing, much like I suppose you could say that the block of voters that voted for the National Party in '94 kind of ended up in the DA. So the voters will kind of end up somewhere.
We before the election, a year before, 2 years before, we were very interested in the ANC voter base. I think what we judged from doing a lot of work on that is that 1/3 of ANC voters are answering the questions as if they are DA voters. You couldn't, by looking at their answers, say if they were ANC voters or DA voters. The only thing you could look at was to see which party they're going to vote for. This is a third, so it's a third. ANC got 40% in this election. It's 45 now, so a third of the base, 15% of a future election, is very vulnerable to breaking out of the ANC. Where you factor in things like, are you a multi-generational middle class voter? Your leans towards the opposition are pretty strong. So the survival for the ANC necessarily means not radicalizing further. It means moving strongly to the center to capture the aspirant middle class market on the urban fringe. That's the biggest future market that exists for the ANC. That market has the same policy interests as the established middle class. It just isn't established yet, but it becomes established through the same policies. So this GNU is a useful thing because the DA established middle class market and the ANC aspirational middle class market benefit from the same policies, but the two parties can't fish in each other's ponds. It's virtually perfect, but I must say what happened in Tshwane with Silvia Brink, he was the mayor, and he got booted. You've got to take that very seriously, because what it would appear to suggest is when the pressure is on, the balance of power in the ANC is not strong enough to defend this GNU. Even where the people doing the defending understand the analysis as I've put it to you. If they were here, they'd say that's correct. It's fortunate for us that this is the case. We can go back over 50. We were much better in our moderate, pragmatic era. But I think it must be very alarming if you're not so much a DA type of voter, a non-ANC voter, because the ANC's headed for suicidal consequences if it carries on like it's doing in Gauteng. But if you're a sort of person who's been deeply invested in the ANC, or perhaps this is multi-generational, the party means a lot to you. You appreciate the enormous successes it secured, particularly initially after 1994. This must be most distressing to see that at almost defeated, it managed to strike this deal. It starts the process of recovery. It appears as if there are forces within it that wish to throw all of that away.
Frans, let's dig a little deeper into two regions. One being KZN, where there was a great movement where I think MK, who were caught seemingly completely by surprise by their success in the election and seemed to be woefully underprepared for the job at hand. But then a coalition was formed in KZN to keep MK out of power, a wafer-thin coalition. Do you think that's going to hold? Do you think KZN is going to stay the way it is?
I don't know if it will hold. So,
yeah.
But I can tell you about MK's formation. I don't think MK was taken by surprise, and I think a lot of the media was taken by surprise. Because as it often is, it was plainly apparent for a lot of time before MK became a thing that it might be one, because Jacob Zuma's popularity was very, very high in Natal and very high amongst the key constituency of ANC voters. And I can remember putting this kind of material out, and we might publish a report or say something. I remember one incident of speaking at some dinner of well-heeled people, and I said Zuma's so popular, and the audience complained, and they said a sort of woman who was very wealthy and comfortable and probably hadn't spent much time in KZN, let alone the sort of backwoods, was angry and said, "How can you say Zuma's popular? No one would support a man like that." It's absolutely, it's this bubble that upper middle class, insulated South Africans sometimes live in. He was popular because, and this is later what MK strategists positioned the party as, because they're very shrewd and good at what they do, as is Zuma. I've always been immensely impressed with Zuma's strategic acumen. They position Zuma as the fallen hero, the great hero of the liberation struggle, which in many respects he was. He was very brave. Any of those guys that went up against the might of the sort of Afrikaner state, if you were became senior, if you were caught by the security police, the consequences were very severe for you. They were brave people, Zuma particularly so. He positions himself as the former hero who is flawed. He has flaws. He has made mistakes, as they put it kind of understatedly. And that's great politically, because people themselves realize they're flawed. So Zuma said, I've made mistakes, I've flawed. And he positions himself as former hero who's flawed like everyone else and who has been abandoned by the ANC. Persecuted by the ANC. They wish to lock this old man up and put him in prison. And it's brilliant because it resonates with a large number of ANC voters who say, you know what, I feel the same way too as what he does. This party's abandoned me too. That's what they voted on. They didn't vote so much on his policy manifesto, if you've read it.
Yeah.
Mad. It's almost as mad as the madness that approaches the American and European Africa doctrine that says we should turn off our power stations at the moment of the GNU, which might save the southern tip of Africa, somewhat open to Western liberal order, lily pad in an otherwise very hostile world. Mad stuff. They didn't vote on that. But I can tell you, you sit on these numbers and you know these things and you make these points, and in genteel, mainstream, polite South African society, this stuff doesn't get out because it's not the sort of thing that is acceptable to think or say. And so the idea, wow, what a surprise. Our polling on MK wasn't far off, but there were a lot of people who said it's complete nonsense because they couldn't get out of their own comfortable upper middle class South African lives or abroad, where they're often criticized from, to realize that what Zuma did was very shrewd, very sophisticated, very well informed, and was therefore likely to deliver real political success for him, which it did.
And obviously at the moment it does seem to be hanging in there and coming at the expense of the EFF that
well, it will be hard for MK to, I mean, the real strategic challenge now in MK is, if this is the motivating factor behind the support, as I've set it out, how do you sustain that after Zuma? It will be very difficult for them to do that.
Let's talk about the DA quickly, because they obviously, one would imagine, if you sort of came into this thing, you would say they are the party that could pick up another 15%, as you mentioned it. These are sort of middle class black voters who vote by stealth. They live in DA-run areas, right? Yeah. They send their kids to the countries that the DA aligns with, but yet they're voting, perhaps ANC or not voting. The DA refuses to pick them up.
I didn't quite say they could get another 15%.
No, but I'm saying it's a
15% that's there.
That's there.
That's different. Yeah. Okay, good. No,
But they're making absolutely no effort, and seemingly, by Helen Zille's own words, doesn't really want to grow. I've got to say, Helen Zille and Dada Marrero, the Joburg mayor, are the only two honest politicians. Helen Zille says she doesn't want the party to grow, which is crazy. Dada Marrero comes into power and says he's going to do nothing, and both of them are delivering on their promises.
Okay, one option the DA has, and I'm not responding to what Helen or anyone else have said, because I haven't actually had a serious conversation with a senior DA person for a long time, so I don't know what they're after. There is a strategy which says do not grow your party much, because the DA constituency is established multi-generational middle class. You may have a lot of sympathy, potential touch points in the aspirant middle class, but it's a different kind of constituency. And you need to know exactly what you're doing if you bring a second constituency into a political party, because it could lead to conflict. A perfectly acceptable strategy, if a DA strategist was here, said this is, I'd say that, said this, I'd say that could work, is the size of the DA will be determined by the size of the multi-generational middle class. And that could be 20 or 25%, maybe you stretch it to 30 if you really knock it out the park. And our strategy is to take that and make a deal with whoever commands the aspirant middle class on the urban fringe. And that is the South African coalition deal. That's good. And that is what they have essentially done. And it is a perfectly good and legitimate thing to do for them. So that definitely is an option. Look, why did South Africa get into a position where one party had almost 70% of the vote? The ANC had just shy of that in 2004. The reason is that for a very, very long time, people in South Africa could not pick their leaders, freely pick their leaders. And the ANC's dominance was a hangover of that, and persisted after 94, just on that momentum, and was always due to be broken once contemporary issues overwhelmed the historical momentum, which is what happened in the election. It's an argument I've had with some DA people. As a fundamentally free and open society, which South Africa completely is, we can say anything we want here. We
can start podcasts.
We could start a party, the two of us. We could challenge the rest. MK for support. We could go to Natal and start campaigning. We could do that. in a very free society, what must happen over time is the politics must start to mirror the nature of that society. People will drift towards political representatives that represent their cultural values. Now, this doesn't mean culture in the sort of ethnic sense necessarily, or language sense. Culture is an assembly of values, and South Africa is not a country in which 70% of people have one value and 20% have a second value and then 10% have a third value. It's much more complex. So a much bigger fragmentation of the country's politics as the momentum of the past dies away, contemporary challenges emerge. If we remain free, you can see a further breakup of politics. And where I might have this argument with some opposition people, is to say, and donors and the like, is the idea of thinking that one party will again rise to a point where it is dominant would be at odds with this analysis. Now, it's possible. You could do it. You had a very charismatic leader. You stood heavily on nationalist ideas. Maybe you can get back to that again. But I think the drift of the evolution of the society, if it remains free, and if we'll must test the if, is that you'll see a growing and a greater fragmentation. And the key reason why the ANC is now under 50%, and my critics who know who they are must hear this, is not because the DA grew by 15 percentage points in the last election. It is because of the fragmentation, the EFF, the MKs, the ASAs of Herman, and the DA. The DA did very well, I thought, through this whole period. But I think that could very well be the trend line continuing. A much bigger fragmentation until some distant point in the future, where the political assembly of parties starts to mirror the fragmented network of cultural values that define different South African communities.
Frans, as we sit here, we're just ahead of the US election, which is on a knife edge. It could go either way. I don't think there's an analyst out there who can really call it, I think we're all going to have to wake up to a result that's going to make 50% of the people very unhappy, right? We're just not sure which 50%. But South Africa sits in the middle of this because there's two very different outcomes for South Africa. What do you think South Africa's options or reality looks like post the American election?
Well, first, let's call it for Trump.
Okay.
Because that's where the data is pointing at.
Right.
If the election was today,
still
a few weeks to go. If it's today, he's done enough, I think, in North Carolina, Georgia, Pennsylvania to pull it off.
Right.
So I think it's him. A Trump win is good for South Africa. Second statement. Because I think the type of administration around him sees Southern Africa as a strategic issue and not as a development problem that must be approached from a moral perspective. I think to an extent in non-Trump administrations, Southern Africa is seen as a developmental problem, and we must Americans must come and help it so that it's less pathetic. I think the Trump side sees it more as a strategic issue. Think in the terms of a triangle. That one of the most important elections of the year happened in the Solomon Islands. This is the year of all these elections. Solomon Islands sit to the east of Australia. The Imperial Japanese Army, after decimating or greatly wounding the American fleet at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, went to great efforts to hold the Solomon Islands in order to cut Australia and New Zealand off from the protection of the Americans in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor. 30 years of Chinese diplomacy and an election result earlier this year and a security agreement struck 2 years ago is positioning China to develop a naval facility, or certainly naval operations from the Solomon Islands, achieving exactly the result that the Imperial Japanese sought to achieve in the Second World War. Draw that line, take a little triangle, we were creating a triangle, and draw a line way across out of the Pacific, through the Indian Ocean, all the way to Djibouti, which sits at the gateway of the Suez Canal, where the PLA, Chinese People's Liberation Army, now has a naval facility that sits across from the American one, guarding the gateway to Suez. So now we've got a line. In the middle of that line, in the middle of the Indian Ocean, it's not part of the line, we're going to complete the triangle just now, are the Chago Islands, and particularly Diego Garcia. And Diego Garcia is terribly important because it is a US military facility that can hold nuclear weapons. An aircraft flying from Diego Garcia can reach the west of Australia, southern China, much of Eastern Europe, Iran, Suez Canal, East Africa. Keir Starmer's new government in the UK has just given the Chago Islands to Mauritius. Mauritius is in Africa. Africa is governed by something called the Pilindaba Treaty, which bans nuclear weapons on the continent. Therefore, Diego Garcia has now become a target of the Pilindaba Treaty. If the US is pressured to remove the nukes, when and where they are on Diego from time to time, its ability to project power across the Indian Ocean and into the South Pacific is hugely degraded. So in the middle, we've got Chago. We've drawn this line from the Solomon Islands to Djibouti. To complete a triangle, draw the line down to the southern tip of Africa. South Africa, the naval base at Simonstown, guards the entry to the South Atlantic. From there, draw it back to the Solomon Islands. China's holding Solomon. It's got Djibouti. Anti-Western actors now have Chago. If you add Simonstown, you have a strategic triangle anchored by, as a friend of mine calls it, the unsinkable aircraft carrier of Diego Garcia, which means the balance of Australia and New Zealand are utterly cut off from the West. Forget Taiwan. It's Australia that's going to become an issue over the next 20 or 30 years, the slow strangulation. The strategic balance of power in the world is I can't remember who the American president was who called I don't remember, who called the Pacific America's lake. That's not going to be true after Solomon. I think the people in the Trump administration understand the extraordinary importance now of the GNU in South Africa surviving to give some shot of South Africa's coastline not being surrendered to what they would see as anti-Western actors. Because if that happens, you complete the triangle. And from the South Pacific to the gateway of the South Atlantic, the West strategic influence is vastly degraded. An administration that thinks in such terms is one from which South Africa's negotiating leverage might be very much greater than under an administration who thinks we need to come and help South Africa with its climate obligations. And on that, there are other arguments as well, but on that argument, I just urge people who think sometimes quite emotionally about people like Mr. Trump, think strategically about the equation. And on balance, one, I've said to you, I think Trump wins. Two, I've said to you, I think that is strategically good for a future South African government, even an ANC government, because an ANC government, if we have one of those again, if this madness of trying to sabotage the GNU comes to an end, we might have an ANC government again. Even an ANC government's strategic leverage is vastly higher, and it can play the West off against Western rivals to secure vast trade and economic concessions for South Africa, which is surely what you'd want if you want to be a very successful and influential emerging market.
Well, there you go. That's why we have him on, Frans Cronje, laying it out for us. So if we've got leaders that are driven more by what's best for South Africa rather than their own ideologies, perhaps a trump card coming for South Africa after the American elections. See what I did there, Frans? A trump card. Good work.
I heard
that. That really
never
brought the house down.
that.
Never heard
Never
that
heard
one
that.
before. It's like when
It's a
people say
first.
this is a sham. I've never heard that one before. But anyway. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on the State of the Nation. Thank you to Pace Car Rental. Thank you most especially to you for watching this, and to Frans Cronje for making it so interesting. Please like and subscribe the channel. We'll see you again on the State of the Nation. Thank you.